You're listening to Public Affairs Radio from C-SPAN. James Sibert was one of two FBI special agents who witnessed the autopsy of President Kennedy. He was interviewed by Jack O'Flaherty on June 30th, 2005.
So I entered the FBI on duty on April the 2nd, 1951, agent training, and that was my start, and I was in the Bureau for 21 years and was I was the senior resident agent of the Hyattsville Resident Agency, which is a part of the Baltimore, Maryland Division.
Thank you, Jim. At this point in time, as Jim mentioned, he was the senior resident agent at the Hyattsville RA. And the main objective for the interview today is with Jim's unique position of being the SRA at that office for the FBI at the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and the circumstances surrounding that, the subsequent travel to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, and then eventually President Kennedy's body transferred to the hospital in the Hyattsville, Maryland area. Jim and another agent were responsible for being the agents from the FBI to witness that autopsy and report on the results. So with that as the lead-in, Jim, maybe you could take it from here.
Well, I remember that day very well because this was the day the inspectors were in the Baltimore Division, and this particular day on November the 22nd in 1963, they were scheduled to come down to Hyattsville Resident Agency and inspect the RA. And also after that, they were to go over to Silver Spring and inspect the RA there. And we had the inspection, and we'd eaten lunch with the two inspectors and come back. They had started on their trip on over to Silver Spring, and we turned on the standard broadcast up in our resident agency office and heard the announcement that the president had been shot over in Dallas. And I immediately called on the radio and got a hold of the two inspectors in their bureau car, told them we'd heard this message and the action that they wanted to take. Maybe they wanted to call headquarters or to that effect. Immediately after that, we called Andrews Air Force Base, which is in our jurisdiction of the Hyattsville Resident Agency, and that's the home base of Air Force One and all the Presidential Flight Unit. And we told them what news we'd heard and asked them if they had any idea what time Air Force One would be returning to Andrews Air Force Base, we didn't know whether the body would be on it or not, but we were trying to get background information. Colonel Best, who was the director of security there with OSI, told us that yes, it would be returning Air Force One with the president's body, and that it was due to arrive around 5:30, and then later on we found out it was to be around 6 p.m. So with that information, I called Mr. Tully, who was my SAC in the Baltimore headquarters, told him that undoubtedly he knew what was going on in Dallas. I told Tully that we had received no information from the Bureau, but we were going on out to Andrews Air Force Base, and that the plane was supposed to arrive at around 6 p.m., and that if he wanted to reach us or the Bureau, we could be reached through the OSI and Colonel Best, and they'd get in touch with us. The plane came in at 6 o'clock, and it was on its final approach when we received a message relayed through the Hyattsville Resident Agency from Baltimore, stating that the Bureau wanted Frank O'Neill and I, to get in the motorcade that was out there and proceed with that to Bethesda and witness the autopsy, obtain any bullets that would be removed from the body, and hand carry those over to the FBI laboratory to preserve the chain of evidence. And so immediately after that, we contacted Jim Raleigh, who was the head of the Secret Service a job comparable to Mr. Hoover's with the FBI, told him what our instructions were, and he put us in the third car of the motorcade.
Former FBI Special Agent James Sibert recorded in June 2005.
We left there, and something interesting here, the Metropolitan Police Department motorcycle squads were out there and going out Suitland Parkway, which was all overpasses. But when we got into Washington, they cleared every intersection with the motorcycle. We'd play leapfrog, go up and clear one ahead, and that motorcade never stopped once from the time it left Andrews Air Force Base until it stopped out at the National Navy Medical Center at Bethesda, Maryland, where the autopsy was going to be performed.
Okay.
When we got there, we got a hold of Special Agent Kellerman and Special Agent Greer of the Secret Service, and they were driving the ambulance containing the body. Told them what our instructions were, and Kellerman said that he'd already been informed by Raleigh that we were there and we were going to also witness the autopsy. I might add here that this is important, that the FBI had no jurisdiction to take over this investigation. In fact, it may sound funny, but there was no federal agency designated by any federal statute on the books that had the authority to conduct the investigation of the assassination or attempted assassination of a president of the United States. This law was passed in 1965. We're talking about 1963 now.
Right. Jim, is it correct, though, that the basis for a jurisdiction was the assault on a federal officer? Is that...
Well, the Bureau never even mentioned jurisdiction or anything. They just said, and we knew that we were in a position where we couldn't make any suggestions there during the autopsy or ask too many questions, because it would look like we'd be controlling it or trying to steer the thing. And
right.
So we were just there in an observatory capacity and get any evidence in the forms of ballistics to take over to the laboratory, FBI lab.
Okay. Well, thanks for that comment about the jurisdiction. That is helpful. So please proceed, Jim.
Start with, they cleared out the autopsy, the anteroom there. And first I might mention that before they cleared it out, the casket was opened. There was no body bags involved in this at all, as has been reported in some reports. The body was wrapped in two wrappings of sheets. First one was around the head area that was blood-soaked, and the second was around the entire body. No clothing was in the casket that arrived at Bethesda. That was sent over to the FBI laboratory. As I say, they cleared the room out so they could do radiology work, take x-rays and photographs, and after they had accomplished these two pieces of that investigation, they invited us back in, and the official autopsy started. The incision was about 8 o'clock, but the preparations and everything had taken this time from the time we arrived out there.
That's 8 o'clock the night of November 22nd,
night.
1963.
And when Commander Humes, James Humes, who was and Commander Boswell were the two autopsy surgeons that both assigned to the Navy Medical Center there at Bethesda. When Humes, who was the chief pathologist who was going to do this, he looked at the body, he said that he could see the tracheotomy had been made in the anterior part of the neck, and he said apparent surgery in the head area. And the reason he said this, there was a piece about the size of a 3x5 card that was missing entirely from the skull. And later on during the autopsy, that piece was flown in. It was found in the limousine out of Dallas. But these were the assumptions made at the start. The autopsy was done, and during the autopsy, I say this one piece was brought in, and when they raised the president up off of the gurney or the autopsy table at this time, they noticed a bullet wound in the back, and Humes measured this, and it was measured in centimeters, and it was in the upper part of the back and to the right of the spinal column.
James Sibert was one of 2 FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy at Bethesda Naval Medical Center when President Kennedy's body was returned to Washington. Here's more on C-SPAN Radio.
I might say here that while Commander Humes was making these measurements of this wound in the back, Commander Boswell was making entries on a face sheet, which has outlines of the body, and he placed this bullet wound, and Boswell listed that as being 7 times 4 millimeters, and 14. That was the size of this, and 14 centimeters from the right acromion, and 14 centimeters below the tip of the right mastoid process, which would make it, of course, in the upper part of the back, but not in the neck area. And they decided that they would probe this. They had a chrome probe, and also I should mention here that during this autopsy, Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology over at Walter Reed Hospital had come over to assist these 2 Navy pathologists, and of course they dealt in a lot of pathology work over there, and a man had sent him, one of the supervisors had sent him over to help. When they probed this back wound with the chrome probe, they couldn't, just a short distance it would go in. They also, the rubber gloved finger, Commander Humes probed that, and they all said there's no exit. So this posed a problem. They were thinking about doing more x-rays. I said, well, let me go and call over to Bureau headquarters, and I'll find out if there's any kind of a bullet that could fragmentize that they wouldn't pick up, or the x-rays wouldn't see. I think they'd already x-rayed part of the back. So I went in and called Agent Killian over in the FBI firearms lab and asked him about this, and he said, well, I guess you heard about the bullet that they found on the stretcher over in Dallas at the Parkland Hospital. And I said, no, what's the deal? He said, well, they don't know which stretcher it was on, whether it was Conley's or Kennedy's, but they found this, and they're flying it into the laboratory. I said, well, is there anything else? He said, no, that's all the information we have at the present time. So I went back and told Commander Humes what I'd heard, what had been relayed to me about this bullet over there. And I might mention here that there had been no contact up to this point, or even later on, between the Bethesda doctors and the Parkland doctors about what had been done at either location. And my way of thinking, this was the time for them to call Parkland and find out what they had done over there on this tracheotomy and this part of the head missing, what they had thought over there, and also what they could add to it. But no call was made. And Hume said, well, it was clear. He said that this bullet wound in the back had probably worked its way out through cardiac manipulation done over at Parkland, and of course they had no verification that that had even been done over there. And he said that it was clear that that was the bullet that had worked its way out, was on a stretcher, and that death was due to this massive opening in the head there that was probably a bullet wound gone in there.
That would have been a separate bullet.
Wound, right?
Separate,
so you had those 2 hits in the body. That would have been. So that was the they removed a couple of fragments, metal fragments. I might say that they did show they developed the radiology work and the X-rays, and when the brain that showed it and threw it up on the screen, it showed just like the Milky Way of minute medical particles, and they were able to remove 2 of those, or 3 it was rather, that they put in a glass jar.
FBI agent James Sibert, along with fellow agent Francis O'Neill, witnessed the autopsy when President Kennedy's body was returned to Bethesda Naval Hospital. This interview, recorded in June 2005, was conducted by Jack O'Flaherty for the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI.
And in the position, excuse me, Jim, in witnessing this autopsy, you and the other agent, O'Brien, Francis O'Brien, O'Neill, you were actually in a position that you were witnessing all the work that the doctors were doing, and
at all times, one of us or both of us were in the autopsy room. There was nothing that went on and one of us was present. And when I went out to make the phone call, O'Neill was in there in the autopsy room. And later on, they had a break, but we were there at all times, and we were close. That was a thing that we were asked. How close were you to the autopsy itself? We were right there around the autopsy table where we could see everything and measurements being taken and all.
Very good. Yeah, you're mentioning this. It's interesting. As you say, they discovered that and measurement, and that's part of the information, the diagram that you're providing to us in connection with this interview, and we appreciate that. But I guess the puzzle or the mystery there was they could not find any exit wound for that bullet, and then you're checking with the lab.
They said it was an entry wound from the rear on the back, but there was no exit wound because, as I say, when they probed it, they said there's no exit.
Okay, thank you.
And that's when we furnished them the information about the bullet over at Parkland was found on a stretcher, and they said that was probably what happened, that during cardiac manipulation over at Dallas, this bullet had worked its way out of this entrance wound in the back, and then this big wound in the head was a cause of death.
Right.
Head wound.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. About the bullet that they're finding on the stretcher, that was actually a bullet that was completely intact?
Well, that's referred to in the single bullet as the magic bullet because it was in almost pristine condition when it was examined when they flew it into the lab. And now, of course, I'll get into this single bullet theory later on.
Sure.
But that was the consensus when we left there that night. And as I said, let me just refer to...
Sure, please do.
I might say here that during the autopsy, an inspection of the area of the brain, there were, I said a while ago, 2 or 3, but there were 2 fragments of metal that were removed by Dr. Humes, namely one of them measuring 7.2 millimeters, which was removed in the right side of the brain, and an additional fragment of metal measuring 1 by 3 millimeters that was removed from this area, both of which were placed in a glass jar by Dr. Humes, and it had a black top on it, and O'Neill and I put our initials and the date on this so we could identify it later on, and we later took this over to the laboratory for examination. There was no large bullet of any kind there at Bethesda during this autopsy that was found. As I say, we hand carried this over to the laboratory and turned it over to them, and our cars were back out at Andrews Air Force Base. We had to get a bureau clerk to drive us out to Andrews from bureau headquarters in D.C. I got in at 4:30 in the morning, and my phone started ringing at 6. And I sent a teletype that night from headquarters to the bureau in Dallas, and I called it in and give it to the night clerk at Baltimore so he could also read it to tell you, I mean, what happened during the autopsy. What happened after that, now this was the autopsy as far as we were concerned. It was done on Friday night, November the 22nd of 1963.
At Bethesda Hospital.
At Bethesda.
No, in Bethesda, Maryland. Yeah,
Bethesda.
Earlier I may have said Hyattsville,
And it
Maryland.
wasn't until much later, several weeks, I was on leave down visiting my sister in Georgia. And my sister answered the phone, of course, and she said, "Jim, it's for you." And it was Lipton that wrote the book, Best Evidence.
You're listening to C-SPAN Radio on WCSP-FM Washington, broadcasting in HD. We're listening to former Special Agent James Sibert, one of two FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy when President Kennedy's body was returned to Washington and taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital following his assassination in Dallas, Texas.
And he identified himself, and he said, "I have in front of me here your FD-302," and he says, about the autopsy at Bethesda, and he said, "It doesn't agree with the official autopsy report." I said, "Official autopsy report?" I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He told me that that didn't agree, and I said, "Well, now, you say you're Lifton, and I don't know who you are." I said, "You say you've got the FD-302?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "All right." I said, "What are the names down at the bottom part of it there?" And he said, "Well, your name and O'Neill's." I said, "Well, now look down with those initials. Is there any other initials in there?" He said, DFL. I said, "Well," I said, "I know that's the chief steno." I said, you've got the FD-302, but I said, I wouldn't have any further comment." He said, "Well, here's what you say," and I said, "Go ahead and read it." He read it to me, and I said, "Well, if that's what it says," I said, "that's what happened that night. That's the record, and I stand by it." He said, "Well, who could I call to find out about this other?" I said, "You can call the Bureau." I gave him the address and everything, and that was when I found out about another change that had been made. Now, I point out here that I never heard anything, and if the autopsy doctors there at the Bethesda had called me Saturday morning and said, "Look, we've called Parkland, we found about they made a tracheotomy over a bullet wound and appeared to be an entrance wound in the neck," I said I would have dictated what they did that night, but it would have been in the form of a memo. It wouldn't have gone out into a summary report to Dallas, the Office of Origin and everything, and we'd have had the two reports as they were given Friday night and what they changed due to that. So, but they ended up with a single bullet theory. And
so that's what, when he said that your 302 does not comport with the results of the autopsy, the official autopsy reports. And then in what regard specifically, again, Jim, that he's saying it?
Well, he
the autopsy report.
He mentioned that we said that surgery in the head area. Well, that, of course, was what the doctor first thought it was. And as I say, this piece of skull was brought in that was probably what he took to be surgery of the head.
Right.
And the autopsy was his observation, his statement. But our conclusion was what Humes had said: cause of death was a severe head wound, and that the other wound in the back had been worked out by cardiac manipulation, fell on the stretcher, and that was it. And that was the conclusions that night, because they knew nothing about this bullet wound in the neck where the tracheotomy had been closed over.
That information was only provided when the surgeon in Bethesda was in contact with the surgeon in Parkland.
Saturday morning.
Saturday morning.
The body was in the custody of the funeral home.
That's November 23rd, then, is that correct?
23rd, right.
23rd, and the body of JFK, John F. Kennedy, the president, is in the possession of the funeral home at that point in time. So that was.
I say, if they would have said, "Look, we've got a change on this autopsy report, we got additional information," we would have dictated what they said just in a
right.
file copy of that.
But
then we'd have waited for what their other one, the report that they submitted, but we never saw that at all, and
okay.
left in the dark.
So just to clarify then, what happened after the doctor at Bethesda received that information from his fellow doctor in Parkland? They went ahead then and modified the results of the autopsy report, but this was after you did not have privy to that modification.
They worked until 5 o'clock Saturday morning. The three doctors, Humes, Boswell, and Fink, and people from the Gawley Funeral Home there, and reconstructing the skull. I mean, they had this piece that came with flowing in and everything.
Yeah.
And then they called after this, after 5 sometime, probably about 7 maybe, they called Parkland. This is the first contact between Parkland and Bethesda. And that's when the doctor over at Parkland said, well, I guess you know, or I don't think he intimated that. He said, well, I guess you should know that where I made this tracheotomy was over what appeared to be a bullet entrance wound.
Former FBI Special Agent James Sibert recorded in June 2005.
In your opinion, Jim, what's the significance historically? Would you think that there would be, what would be the difference from, as I say, from the historical standpoint on treating it, from what your FD 302 reflected based on your presence and your information, as opposed to what the additional information was that put in merely the fact that what was thought to be damage due to the tracheotomy was now indicated to be that's where the wound, the exit wound, right?
Well, what this does is when you get notification that this was a bullet wound, that they put the tracheotomy and cut through that over at Parkland, you've got another bullet to contend with. Our report dealt with 2 bullets, but only one, the head wound, and the back wound not being a wound that would contribute to death or anything. Whereas you change this from the single bullet theory with the wound being moved up gradually to the base of the neck in the back, where it would enter from the rear at a downward angle in the base of the neck, and then come out in the anterior wound. This wouldn't be an entrance wound, it would be an exit wound. And then they had this same bullet hitting Connolly and in the back and the arm and the radius, and some of it ending up in his thigh left there. And this is the single bullet theory that which has nothing to do with the death of the president.
Right.
That's the bullet wound in the head where it was blowing out.
Yeah. And as I recall in the report of the Warren Commission at the building where Oswald was located and fired the rifle from, that on the floor out of that window were 3 spent shells. So that's where then the presumption was that then there was a 3rd round that was fired. Mm-hmm. And if they couldn't have located that, would that have been a round? Would that possibly, could that have been the round that?
There have been a lot of theories on this. There was one of them said that they thought that there was a misfire, not a misfire, but a miss. Mm-hmm. And you remember that the curb was struck by,
yes, and
one fellow, the piece of the curb splintered his cheek and everything. So that would be, if you had 2 bullets, the one in the back, the one in the head, and then the one that was a miss, that would be 3 bullets. But they have even been conjecture that maybe there was more than that. And there was a motorcycle that belonged to the Dallas Police Department that the key was left open on the radio. And there was some noise on that, and one of them sounded like a bullet wound off of the tapes. But there was a question, they thought too that it could have been backfire from a car or a motorcycle. So no one, I don't think, has an accurate hadn't been decided yet.
Right. The report of the Warrant Commission, though, that reveals the modification that was conducted, that was provided on the autopsy based on the conversation and the surgeon in Bethesda with the surgeon in Parkland. Yeah.
Now, O'Neill and I didn't go before the Warrant Commission. We were never called. We were interviewed by our inspector, senator from Pennsylvania, who was the counsel for that, and we were notified through Baltimore that we were to be interviewed, given a date, and it would be in the inspector's office in Washington, D.C. And we went down there, and the inspector interviewed O'Neill and I for, probably 30 minutes or so. And we weren't able to take notes on this, but when we came out, I told Frank, I said, Frank, the first place we're going to stop is Bureau headquarters. And I said, from fresh recollection, while it's still fresh memory, I said, we're going to dictate a memo as to what questions we can recall him asking us and what our responses were, which we did.
Special Agent James Sibert worked out of Hyattsville, Maryland at the time of President Kennedy's assassination. When the body was brought to Bethesda Naval Hospital, he and another agent witnessed the autopsy. Here's more on C-SPAN Radio.
Later on, I was really had to testify before two congressional committees. One was the House Select Committee on Assassinations. This was in 1977, and they came down from Tampa by plane, the agents from this agency, and interviewed me at a motel over here in Fort Myers. And then I never was called. I was called some by the Bureau headquarters about maybe right after this happened, and our FD 302 was published. They say, was this your wording or Dr. Hume's? And of course we assured them that anything, the measurements and all, was ours, was the Hume's, not ours. We weren't doctors. But when I think about it, then in 1997, 20 years later, the Assassination Records Review Board was appointed to go out. And I might say here, too, that this House Select Committee on Assassinations ended up with the conclusion that it was probably a conspiracy, but no one would be able to prove it. Now, this was in their report, and this was also mentioned at the Assassination Records Review Board. But the review board made it quite clear when I went up there for a 4-hour deposition that this was not, they were not going to arrive at any conclusions. They were going to gather all the information they could get from witnesses, any kind of notes, communications, things of that type they would obtain, and this would all go on the internet, which it did, and everything. And when I went up there for that deposition in 97, I was asked about this interview that we had given over at the Bureau, or the memorandum that we had given them about this questions Specter had asked us. And the person that asked us these questions, interrogated us, was Attorney Jerry T. Gunn, G-U-N-N, on the Assassination Records Review Board. And he asked me, he said, now isn't it true that after you were interviewed by Specter that you dictated this memo over at the Bureau? He said, did you ever see this after it was typed up? And I said, no. I said, it was a Bureau memorandum that would go in their headquarters, but I never saw the thing to proofread it or anything. He said, well, take a look at this. And he handed me a 3.5-page, or rather a 5-page thing all typed up. He said, is this pretty well? I said, this is it. I said, it's in question-answer form and everything. O'Neill and I both saw this, and we were both given copies there. And in that, when we were interviewed, Specter asked us, he said, did you make any notes? And we said, oh, many notes. And he said, well, what, do you have them now? We said, no. He said, well, where are they? And we said, they were destroyed. And under Bureau policy back in those days, you dictated within 5 days, and you checked your dictation typed up when it came back from the steno pool and made any corrections for the steno to correct. when it came back and it compared with your notes, you initialed the top copy for the file copy and destroyed your notes. And when he said, now, did you ever see what Spectre said when they gave us the interview? Or interviewed, what your responses was? And I said, no. And he gave me a 1.5 page paper that was nothing in question and answer form. He said...
That's a letter from Senator Spectre?
A memorandum from Arlen Spectre to Mr. J. Lee Rankin, who was on the Warren Commission. He was sort of the secretary, general secretary, kept all the notes made by the
right.
7-man member and everything.
And the date of that memorandum?
The date of this memorandum is March the 12th, 1964. So at that time, he already had possession of our report, that Dallas summary report, where our whole 302 was in there, and an interview with him. But he says in this, and this is something I've never been able to be at peace with. He said, S.A. Sibert advised that he made no notes during the autopsy. S.A. O'Neill stated that he made only a few notes which he destroyed after his report was dictated. And also he asked us about the time we'd spent in the Bureau, and I told him I was approaching 13 years, and O'Neill was approximately 10 years of service in the Bureau. And he said, I interviewed Special Agents Francis X. O'Neill and James W. Sibert in my office on March the 12th, 1964, from approximately 10 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. So it's 45 minutes that he said that he interviewed us.
From the Oral History Project of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI, James Sibert. Conducting the interview is Jack O'Flaherty.
And he's stating in there that you're stating that you did not take any notes.
He asked me, he said I said that I never made any notes. And he must have thought I was a genius. I mean, I had names of people that attended their ranks, times, decisions, and everything like that. It'd be impossible to remember all that kind of stuff.
So you
FD-302s.
You did take notes, and so that's a completely erroneous.
And this was a joke.
And so that's an erroneous statement then on the part.
That's right. Yeah, it's a false statement.
Yes. The notes that you took, they were also destroyed after you really provided on the form of the 302, which was pretty much the procedure, I think.
This 302, we sent it back for corrections because this was a joint FD-302.
Correct.
O'Neill had a bunch of notes, so he just a notebook. I had a bunch, and we sit right there together and dictated this thing.
Right. For the
now, I might say this on this single bullet theory.
Please go ahead.
When you had the other autopsy, no other autopsy, the other autopsy report, because there was no autopsy done at Parkland. I might mention here too that Texas has a law that if there is a murder committed in Texas, the autopsy has to be done in Texas. And you had the circuit judge there talking with Kellerman, who was a Secret Service agent in charge, and he said, you can't remove this body and take it back to Washington or to Bethesda. He said, because Texas law. And he said, well, we're taking it. There was some strong discussion there, and finally the Rose, who was the old, he was the county examiner.
Coroner?
County coroner is what I was trying to think.
County coroner.
He would have done the autopsy there if they would have kept the body there in Texas, because he had done the autopsy on Oswald, he did the autopsy on Ruby, he did the autopsy on Tippett, the officer that was gunned down, and he would have done the autopsy on the president, I mean, had it been done there. But, so when you had this other wound, you had this change. They moved this up. Even Burley, Kellerman, Burley was the president's personal physician, Kellerman and Greer, the two Secret Service agents, O'Neill and myself, all said that when that face sheet, or when the face sheet was where the bullet wound had been. And as I say, that was verified by Burley. And when they come out with this thing about it being the base of the neck, they said that bullet wound, all of us agreed that later on that it was much lower than that.
Lower than the neck.
Yeah.
For the record, for this interview, Jim, why don't you go through on and maybe just identify the documentation that you've been kind enough to make copies of.
Here too,
please do.
And that was when this assassination records review board went around to different people. I didn't have my, they were destroyed, but I took up some other things that I got out of the magazine. Journal American Medical Association had some interviews in there with Humes and everything, and I took those up, and they already had them. But they were, so when they were doing, they told O'Neill and I that, and it came out later in July of 1997, this is they said that they went to J. Lee Rankin's son, because J. Lee Rankin had died.
You're listening to C-SPAN Radio and former FBI Special Agent James Sibert, one of two agents who witnessed the autopsy when President Kennedy's body was returned to Washington.
I might say that Ford, Gerald Ford, is the only living member of the Warren Commission now, of those members. And they went to Rankin's son and they said, would you by any chance have anything memorabilia like that your dad gave you, something you could keep? And he said, I might be better than that, might be able to do you better than that. And he went upstairs and came out with a big trunk-like affair which contained 40,000 notes, all of which were made by the 7 members of the Warren Commission, and all their discussion on this. And when they reviewed all of these, they had a chance to review them, they noted that the final report that went out as the Warren Commission, not the FBI report, because we still don't have any jurisdiction, stated that this bullet wound was in the base of the neck. And they noticed, in comparing all the notes, Russell's and all the others, and that Ford had changed this, Gerald Ford, so they called him out at Colorado. And he admitted he changed it. And I have here a copy of the Associated Press, appeared in the Fort Myers News Press on July the 3rd, 97. And that's the statement of the whole thing here. And it says, 33 years ago, Gerald R. Ford took pen in hand and changed ever so slightly the Warren Commissioner's key sentence of the place where a bullet entered John F. Kennedy's body when he was killed in Dallas. And
and does it state where the change was made from, instead of the...
I'll read that right here.
Sure.
Associated Press article said, the staff of the commission, now this means the Warren Commission staff, had written, quote, a bullet had entered his back at a point slightly above the shoulder and to the right of the spine. Ford suggested changing that to read, a bullet had entered the back of his neck at a point slightly to the right of the spine. The final report said, quote, a bullet had entered the base of the back of his neck slightly to the right of the spine. And it said, I say that was the Warren Commission, which has been changed, and so for that reason, they asked me, "What you witnessed the autopsy? What do you think happened?" And I always say this: I don't for 1 minute say that I don't believe there was a conspiracy or there was not a conspiracy. But when it comes to the single bullet theory or the magic bullet theory, I won't buy it. I stood right there as close as I am to you here, a couple of feet, and looked right into that back wound, and I have read the reports on the holes in the clothing, and they mention, and I have all this other, where it was moved gradually by, and later by Ford in the official report, and I just can't.
And by that single bullet theory, or as you say, the magic bullet theory, you mean what? A contention that
This isn't the bullet that has anything to do with the death of the president.
that was the
massive skull.
right.
But the single bullet theory is to account for Connolly being hit and all this, you know.
I see.
It enters the president's back, or to the one report, but to the base of the neck,
The other.
so that it can come out the anterior neck through this hole where the trachea incision was made.
And then went on
It
to
goes over, and it can't keep a straight line either. If it hits Kennedy, it would diagnose and die, and hits him and wounds him,
you mean
and comes out on a stretcher in a pristine condition.
yeah, wounds the governor of Texas, Connolly. Yeah.
From June 2005, former FBI Special Agent James Sibert.
Now they claim that in this single bullet theory that this bullet, when it entered the base of the neck, it didn't hit any bone, but there was no probing done to prove that night at the autopsy. I know we were there until it was concluded.
There was nothing done to determine if there were any shattered bones. Yeah.
No going down through, trying to trace that bullet down through the neck, coming out. You had the Attorney General, who was the President's brother. You had Burley, who was a retired admiral, the President's personal physician. And Jackie Kennedy, who, of course, was familiar with that. And I think their idea was to get him back to Washington and to Bethesda, which was a U.S. Naval Hospital. Even Humes, when he was interviewed by the Journal of American Medical Association editor, said when he heard out he was going to be doing the autopsy, he says, "Why in the world aren't they doing it at Walter Reed at the Armed Forces Association of Pathology, Institute of Pathology, Armed Forces Institute of Pathology?" He said they're much more up to date on that. But of course, the decision had been made. Now, why should it have been conducted at Dallas? As I say, you had Dr. Rose there, this county coroner that was well respected in autopsy circles, pathologist. The clothing would have been there for the doctors. The presidential limousine would have been there with all the bullet nicks and
Right, for further examination?
Yeah, for work had been done. Rose at Parkland would have been aware of the bullet wound in the neck. The doctors are all there, and the nurses are all there to help do any questions. You lost all that when you moved the body to Bethesda. Dallas police were available on the scene that had conducted Tippett and all this and everything. All leads would have been coordinated through Dallas, because later on President Johnson put the Bureau in charge of this whole investigation, but this wasn't that night when decisions had to be made. And wounds of Governor Connolly and JFK could have been considered as related to the shooting. You had both of them right there, and doctors and nurses attended both of them. And another thing, I don't know what you thought of this or not, but ignoring the Texas law requiring autopsies to be done there probably caused some ill feelings between Parkland doctors and the Bethesda doctors, because he was just more or less kidnapped out of the Dallas hospital there.
Parkland.
And put on Air Force One with President Johnson in Sportsville. So I don't think there was any animosity, but maybe, I don't know why Bethesda didn't they're a civilian Navy hospital. I mean, military is composed with Parkland civilian. Maybe they didn't hesitate to call over there because of that and thought, well, we'll do it our way. So those are some of the reasons.
So you feel the emotions were running high on the president's side, the family side, and everyone to remove this back to
That's right.
D.C.
I think the decision was made, and in fact, I learned later, and this was through source I had in Secret Service, that they didn't even decide on Bethesda until they were in the traffic pattern up there, the military traffic pattern there in the Washington, D.C. area, and they finally decided that they'd go into Bethesda rather than land there at Walter Reed, or the place where they were getting to Walter Reed, or where the Army Institute of Pathology is there, that would have helped along too.
To your knowledge, Jim, to what extent was an autopsy conducted at Parkland? Like, was it halfway through, or there was
none done?
None done.
In fact,
just that tracheotomy.
That's right, and he wasn't even turned over on the stretcher. I've reviewed the reports of the autopsy, not the autopsy, but the examination there, what was done at
Parkland, Dallas.
They didn't know, now get this, Parkland didn't know about the wound in the back when he left there. And when Bethesda gets the body, they didn't know about the bullet wound in the neck. Now, isn't this pathetic for the President of the United States? What do we learn out of this? Well, we've got a law now in 1965 that happens. If I was a senior resident agent there in the Bureau, but if this would have happened now, I would be responsible because the Bureau would have exclusive jurisdiction and it would be a federal law. And I would have been free to say, don't you think you should call Parkland? Let's call Parkland and find. But if I had done it back then, all it would have taken was a call by some high-ranking official or admiral or general, say you've got an agent, tell Mr. Who you've got an agent over here trying to run the autopsy, and I'd have been on my way to Butte, Montana with cumulus nimbus clouds and hail coming out of them.
You think, in fairness, Jim, I guess to the doctors at Parkland, and not discovering that wound in his back, they didn't turn him over. Maybe that was due to the decision to rush and get Kennedy out of there. Yeah.
They said no autopsy here. This is what Kellerman and them told them. We're going back to Washington. We do it there. Yeah. Sure, that was it. And see, now they inserted a tube on that tracheotomy, too, and they did everything they could, but that massive
head wound,
the doctors they knew that it was just a question of when to administer last rites.
Former Special Agent James Sibert was one of two FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy of President John Kennedy at Bethesda Naval Hospital. He was interviewed by Jack O'Flaherty on June 30th, 2005. You're listening to C-SPAN Radio and more recordings from the Oral History Project of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI.